Our speaker for this public affairs breakfast program is Zeid Hussein. He will be speaking about his role as UN High Commissioner and the human rights agenda for the future. Having known Zeid for several years now, I've been watching his meteoric rise on the world stage. From his earliest days at the Jordanian mission to the United Nations, to his central role in establishing the International Criminal Court, to his posting as Jordan's ambassador to the United States, then back again to the UN, I can say that his recent appointment as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was no surprise.
Friends, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to imagine for a moment a world without human rights, a space so brutal, violence is the only currency of human exchange. Fear is its fuel and its tranquilizer, a world where cruelty and deprivation mark all, where conflict slides unopposed on rails of discrimination and hatred, with every person desperately scratching for benefit for themselves alone, where every man, woman, and child struggles against arbitrary and capricious power, where even the rulers in their tyranny live in fear that they will be violently overturned. It is a wretched place, our nasty little hut of suffering. 70 years ago, from the smoke of a war more hideous and devastating than the colossal burn that ended in 1918, states built a system of peace, again. And from the pain of that most savage conflict and the most detailed, mathematically planned genocide the world had ever seen, these states knew if countries and peoples could not live together, they would recycle the past behavior again, but with nuclear weapons, no one will win, all would be annihilated. And so they built the United Nations and drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It begins, and I quote, "Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world," end quote. Recognition of the inherent dignity and the inalienable and equal rights of every human being, a respect for difference, and beyond it, a sense that whatever our differences, we are one, locked together on this planet where all of us must live and die. These are the foundations of freedom, equality, and justice. And freedom, equality, and justice are what hold the four letters HOPE together. Is this interletter space now crumbling? In 1932, Albert Einstein wrote a remarkable letter to Sigmund Freud. It was just 14 years after the end of World War I, and as Europe struggled to its feet, a thuggish political group, the Nazi Party, which was destined to drive both men from their homelands, had just received more votes than any other political party in Germany. Is there any way of delivering mankind from the menace of war? Einstein wrote. Is it possible to control man's mental evolution so as to make him proof against the psychosis of hate and destructiveness? End quote. Freud had developed a theory that in all human beings, latent savage urges spring to life when forces that ordinarily would inhibit them cease to operate. His answer to Einstein is very long, and I would not agree with parts of it, but on this point, I think it is worth quoting extensively. Under primitive conditions, it is superior force, brute violence, or violence backed by arms that lords it everywhere, Freud writes. But he says, the superiority of one strong man can be overborne by an alliance of many weaklings. L'union, or union, fait la force. He continues, for the transition from crude violence to the reign of law, a certain psychological condition must first obtain. The union of the people must be permanent and well organized. It must enact rules to meet the risk of possible revolts. It must set up machinery ensuring that its rules, the laws, are observed, and that such acts of violence as the laws demand are duly carried out. This recognition of a community of interests engenders among the members of the group a sentiment of unity and fraternal solidarity which constitutes its real strength." End quote. So the answer to Einstein's question, how to prevent war, is, Freud says, the rule of law and the ties of sentiment that it helps to generate, the bonds of compassion and identification or empathy. What exactly is the rule of law, and how do we amplify its effects on empathy? There are essentially two ways to look at the rule of law. One, quite simply, ignores the content of the laws. What matters is their formal structure. If laws are properly passed, enacted by a competent authority, public, non-retroactive, and so on, then one properly enforces them. This is a narrow, legalistic, and procedural vision. Rule by law rather than rule of law. It ignores the fact that some laws may be unjust. Indeed, tyranny operates on that very basis. Apartheid is an example of a situation that was governed by rules which were themselves unjust and illegal under international human rights law. The second vision of rule of law goes much deeper. This rule of law invokes looking at the ways in which laws ultimately contribute or fail to contribute to the legal protection of the human rights which stem from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 10 great human rights treaties and conventions, themselves the distillation, the accumulated wisdom drawn from the long pain of human suffering or human experience, with roots in customary law and, of course, religious law. Those universal human rights principles include the right to life, liberty, and security of person, the rejection of torture, freedom from unlawful or arbitrary arrest or detention, and the right to a fair trial. They include equality, the right to education, health, food, shelter, clothing, and social protection, the rejection of any form of discrimination, whether based on sex, race, ethnicity, color, belief, sexual orientation, or any other factor, freedom of expression and association, and the right to privacy, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. The question here is justice. Is the law just? The quality of lawmaking process is as important as the quality of the law. Rule of law requires transparency. There should be no secret rules. The views of those directly affected must be considered, and all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, and including the state itself, must be accountable for any breaches of law. Only this vision of the rule of law prevents a law from being enacted to permit torture or to deprive women or ethnic minorities of the right to vote. It is also this vision which is grounded in equality, participation, transparency, accountability, and the collective good, which creates Freud's ties of sentiment. Let me return to the subject of hatred and violence, the ultimate expression of which is the calculated destruction of human life altogether. What often precedes the horrors will be a slow bubbling simmer of hatred, first verbal, then involving personal acts of physical intimidation and attacks, followed by discrimination, seeping into all kinds of acts and laws, leading up in crescendo to a massive eruption of violence. But in the beginning, there was speech. It is axiomatic that the freedom of expression, including speech, is foundational to the maintenance of human dignity. It is on this freedom that democracy rests, because this freedom swings the gate wide open for individuals to argue for their enjoyment of all other rights. It is essentially the window into and from which the freedom of thought can have meaning. The ties of sentiment also demand freedom of expression, because tyranny and at the extreme, atrocity will thrive through its absence. And so tyranny will always attempt to quash it. Although, and here's the rub, tyranny will also often pervert its use by others, abuse it, transform it expertly into an incitement to hatred in order to impose its will. It's not just tyranny that will be tempted to do so, but also those filled by bigotry and chauvinism and ultimately hatred. Significantly, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, distinguishes between the right to the freedom of expression in Article 19 and the incitement to hatred in Article 20. The latter reads that, and I quote, "Any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law," end quote. The trick before us, therefore, the very real challenge, is how to know the boundary to recognize when one becomes the other. Naturally, the freedom of expression requires wide berth and should be expansive, for you may be offended. And the right to freedom of expression, while it is to be enjoyed by everyone equally, ideally, in practice, in a community that thinks, it would be exercised by only a few, the fringe, as the majority would be just too aware of the perils when many, most, or all exercise it at its very limits, because the dangers of a breach into Article 20 increase dramatically with every and each successive jump in numbers. And yet, the threshold separating the two articles must also remain high. For the reasons I've already stated, Article 19 is still the best check against tyranny. Given how important these two articles are, my office began to organize, starting in 2012, a number of expert meetings devoted to identifying the elements which help improve our understanding as to where the boundary between the two articles lies. They examine the context, the intent, who the speaker is, the form or content of the expression, and the extent of it, and the likelihood of or imminence of violence. Formalized and known as the Rabat Plan of Action, we are pleased to note that this initiative is now generating a great deal of interest, and we're working together with civil society, particularly in the Middle East and North African region, on its further development and elaboration. In effect, we are working hard to solidify the foundations for Freud's ties of sentiment. But there are also much broader and more insidious forms of intolerance in societies, including democratic societies, that should not and probably cannot be dealt with by prohibitions and the application of criminal law. What do we do about stereotypes, about prejudice, about the insidious assumptions that form a shadow across so many interactions, shaping the view that humanity is divided into sharply etched groups? Today, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, xenophobia, and anti-migrant feelings are once again rising, not only in Europe, though they are certainly rising in Europe, but also elsewhere across much of the world. So can we correct it? Can people of different backgrounds, history, and religion live together and remain true to themselves without pushing others away? The answer is yes, and it lies, of course, in education, but not in formal education, but in education starting in primary schools, shaped heavily by a basic understanding of human rights. Education in rights, the content and why of human rights. The world's little human being must also know that he or she too has rights. They must practice those rights. They must be critical in their mental orientation and above all humane and kind. Children and adults can learn to uphold the dignity of others, to detect scapegoating, and to analyze the instinct that may lead us to blame others when life feels insecure. Schools the world over themselves must also practice the very rights they aspire to teach. The environment itself must enable it. For evil is not the exclusive property of moral monsters, the Hitlers, Pol Pots, Turcomadas, and Tamerlanes of our history. The power to choose between good and evil is within reach of all of us, as Oregon says. Moral blankness and indifference to the fate of others is a choice. We may understand it, but we must resist it. When people retract into blankness about the fate of others, this may stem from fear. It may be a partial blankness. Our group is important, their group is not fully equal, fully deserving of human rights. The need for a sense of belonging, we matter, but they do not, is a powerful tug. But the path of moral blankness and discrimination leads to hatred and to the world of war. Unchecked, it threatens us all. Schools are not the only place of learning. We learn new lessons throughout our lives. But schools can create and radiate outwards a culture of respect, not only in ethics classes, but also throughout the school curriculum. And I am increasingly surprised, for example, by the fact that the vast majority of schools across the world focus only on the narrow history and geography of their own countries, ignoring the fact that many students can claim their origins in other cultures. For greater respect and better knowledge of the world, can we not introduce a curriculum of global history? Such a subject, which is taught currently in a very few schools and universities, can develop a sense of the common patterns that emerge across all frontiers. The interconnections, cultural, economic, ecological, and demographic among world societies. The ways in which people have grappled with and released themselves from tradition. And the deep history of migration, the sway of peoples that have irrigated every culture. Inevitably, these lessons anchor within us the deep conviction that all human beings are equal. A Jewish family fleeing Nazi persecution, a Tutsi family fleeing the cold glint of the knife in 1994, a woman, man, or child fleeing war, persecution, or economic despair. All these people are fully deserving of human rights. Our planet is indivisible. There is no longer such a thing as a small, faraway country. No such thing as an acceptable level of discrimination against any group. But as the years take us further away from the memory of the terrible wars of the past century, their lessons may seem less urgent. Our alertness fades, and we forget that intolerance, though it begins as a murmur, will arc into a movement that will blight human lives and obliterate peace. We must build respect and acceptance, and not just tolerance into our societies, tirelessly beginning again and again, repairing constantly the rule of law and the bonds of empathy. Only in this way can every government, every society, and all of us truly and in very practical terms embody the principles of our equal and universal human rights and divert us from becoming a nasty little hut of suffering and keep us peaceful, keep us humane on this little blue pearl we call Earth, the home of all us humans. I thank you very much.
The intensified refugee problems and the great numbers over the past 10 years or so have occurred during periods of terrible fighting. To what extent could we hope for the refugee problems to be alleviated if, as and when, peace is brought to some of these warring areas?
Well, you have to hope and expect that some will return voluntarily if the fighting came to an end, and with time you were able to see enough security where people would decide to return home. But as has been said now on a number of occasions, the average stay of a refugee family outside the country of origin now is about 20 years. And so many may not go. And again, the question is, if we all decide that we don't want any of these people, what does the world look like then? What does the world look like? And this is the concern that we see in certain parts. Politicians weighing on populist tendencies or popular feeling, riding a wave based on anti-immigrant or anti-migrant rhetoric. And we've been there before, we've seen this before. And it's almost you want to say to the victims of yesterday, how dare we do this again? Have we learned absolutely nothing? And I think this is what worries us when we see these sort of trends returning. It's so easy to stir popular discontent like this. And we've been, as the Human Rights Office, really quite sharp with those political parties, political leaders who push this particular and front this particular policy. It's almost like there's a complete absence of understanding of 20th century history. And perhaps with a closer look, one can see the perils of moving in this direction.
My question is going to be sort of along the theme of what you were talking about, but also specifically related to Daesh, the Islamic State. They're a group that obviously doesn't care about international legitimacy. They don't care about the Universal Declaration. Do you have anything in your toolkit that can tackle the group, or are they an ultimate example that the only way they can be defeated is through military confrontation, something which you've spoken against in some ways?
Well, I mean, there's an obvious response. I think in 2004 and 5, the mentor of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of Daesh, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, was battling away in Iraq. There were beheadings that were publicized, victims in orange jumpsuits. And we had countless meetings in the UN Security Council about their actions. And almost with an unprecedented investment in money and in military force, 8, 9, 10 years later, the group is still there, Takfiri group, more powerful than it was ever the case 8 years ago. So clearly the bombing algorithm is not one that can work. It requires a much more, as I've suggested in the lecture, a much more sophisticated response, and one where certainly the state cannot itself cut corners on its own obligations to human rights. Because if the state does that, if the state decides that somehow these situations are new, not taken into account by the law, which they're mistaken in believing, as Kofi Annan once said, they deliver to the extremists victories that the extremists could never themselves have hoped for. And if you reduce civil society in a country into a hollow shell for fear that they are the mediums through which extremists spread their message, you actually do the extremists a favor, because they too want to get rid of civil society. They see it in the opposite form, that civil society, pushing for an open space for the expression of dissent, for their ability to express dissent, is the greatest antidote to extremist tendencies. So you have this amazing sort of twinning of effort by some of these security state structures and the extremists in crushing the very thing that will hold the country together with some semblance of peace in communities at sort of a grassroots level. So I think that's the first response. The second one, do they care? Well, don't forget the Taliban, developed a sort of takfiri embraced the Takfiri ideology, again about 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, no one would talk to them, right? No one would speak to them. And that has changed. And the interesting thing is that the Taliban now have prohibited the use of certain weapons. They recognize that there's a level of human suffering which cannot be supported, right? And so who knows where we'll be in 10 years' time. It's interesting, we had a discussion with a group of very seasoned UN mediators, and they were telling us that in Central America, the only frames through which they could push the political discussions in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, was the human rights frame. They all could agree that there were certain boundaries over which or beyond which you couldn't go in terms of human cruelty. And if they could agree on that, they could agree that there was a sort of normative human rights framework that all of us must uphold, then that was the starting point for the discussions that ensued, the political discussions. And so there is also some thinking that needs to be invested in that direction. Thank you so much, everyone.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.